first set an assignment, the first thing you need to do before you do any planning or any writing or even any kind of thinking or reading around the subject is to make sure you really understand the question. So one good way to do this is to try and break the question down into sections. So obviously the questions that you're set for your assignments will look much more complicated than this, but they'll still have these same components. So pretty much any essay question or assignment brief that you might be set will have what we call task words, which are things like explain, discuss, analyse, evaluate. There will be a wider subject that's normally quite broad. So here we've got the development of youth culture. And then you will almost always have a focus, so something that narrows down that subject. It's really important to pay attention to this, that there should never be a reason that you're set an absolutely massive subject to discuss. You'll be given some way of kind of narrowing this down to make it manageable within the word count. So always think about that focus and how that directs your reading, the topics that you should be interested in. Obviously that broader subject is important too, but really, really important is that task word. What are you actually being asked to do? If you're not sure about task words, or if you're not sure what the differences are between analyse or evaluate or discuss, just Google it. There's loads of explanations online about task words in relation to academic writing and how that should direct your thoughts about what you're going to do in this assignment, how you're going to write it and what you're going to say. In terms of the overall structure, so thinking about the big picture for planning or thinking about a piece of work, we can normally break down most standard essays or pieces of academic writing into 3 different parts. So obviously we always have an introduction and a conclusion, and then the main part of your essay in the middle. What actually goes into these sections hopefully shouldn't be a surprise. There's nothing particularly new here in this diagram, but what is really useful to think about is the rough percentage of the word count allocated to each section. So this is just a very rough rule of thumb. It's not something you have to stick to very kind of closely. But if you think about allocating about 10% of your word count to your introduction and then about 10% of the word count again to the conclusion, that should give you introductions and conclusions that are fairly balanced, equally weighted in terms of the space they take up and the kind of content allocated to them. But importantly, it gives you lots of space for the main body of your essay, which is obviously where most of the important work is done, the argument, the different perspectives that you might want to acknowledge and discuss. So when we think about planning an essay or an assignment, bear that in mind. Always think about your word count, how much space you've got, how much you think you might want to write, and then start thinking about the main ideas that you want to cover. So it's really important when you do this to get this down, get this written down or mapped out in some kind of way. So this can be whatever works for you. It could be a list of bullet points. It could be post-it notes up on a wall. It could even be that you jot ideas down on PowerPoint slides that you can then shuffle around and rearrange. There's lots of different ways of planning and lots of different tools available to help you with this. But however you get these initial ideas down, it's really important that you can kind of rearrange them, reorder them, and play with different structures or different orders, but also to have a bit of a bird's eye view. So hopefully you can step back from that mind map or that list of post-it notes or whatever it might be. You can step back and see overall everything that you're covering, and also the order in which you want to do so. So don't be afraid to shuffle things around. Think about an order that works best for you, an order of ideas that flows and that feels logical, but it might take a bit of experimenting to get there. Once you've then got a rough sense of the order, the bigger topics, the chunks of information or ideas that you want to work through, then try and plan in more depth. So the easiest way to make writing simple and to flow and to not struggle with things like writer's block is to plan in as much depth as possible. So here we've broken this planning process down even further. So we're thinking about planning even down to the level of each section or subsection of a paragraph. So what is each paragraph going to say? What point is it making, or what topic is it covering? And also, as part of this, start trying to build in the references that you want to use. So hopefully by this point you're starting to do some reading, or perhaps you've done most of your reading. You've got a sense of the evidence, the references that you're going to use as part of your writing. So where are they going to come in? What references are going to be relevant for each of the different paragraphs? And then what are you going to say about them? So what argument are you trying to build? What's your discussion going to be? The best essays will build in some kind of critical discussion or critical analysis of the evidence or the references that you're using. And then what conclusion is this paragraph building towards? So a good way to think about this, as we've got here, is this kind of so what question. At the end of every paragraph, just kind of ask yourself, well, so what? What is this paragraph adding? What's it saying? How is it answering the question? What is it contributing? Essentially, you never want your marker to get to the end of a paragraph in your writing and think, well, so what? What was the point of that paragraph? What's that added? So kind of preempt that, build that question in as you are planning and thinking about your content. So what? Make sure you know what the answer to that question is. Well, this paragraph says this, or this paragraph develops that idea. Make sure you're pretty firm on that as you move towards the writing process. And hopefully all of this planning and thinking very carefully about structure will help you write a really well-rounded, thorough, well-evidenced paragraph. So this is a slight development on the previous slide, but it's basically just a little 5-step process, a bit of a template for you to use as you start writing full paragraphs within a draft piece of work. So most students are good at doing points 1, 2, and 3. Everyone knows to introduce your point as you start a new paragraph. You then expand on that. You then bring in your references or your evidence in whatever form that might be. The really important work that happens in a paragraph then tends to be what happens next. It's, well, what do you do with that evidence? What do you want to say about it? Can you be analytical about it? Can you evaluate it in any way? How are you going to link it back to the question? So all of that kind of content tends to happen, towards the middle and end of the paragraph. Okay, it's that kind of commentary, that analysis, what you're saying about the references that you've used. That's so important, and it's one of the parts of your writing that will really help to kind of count towards your mark. What markers don't want to see is a paragraph that starts with a point, develops it a bit, provides some references, and then moves on to the next paragraph. Okay, so always think about these 4th and 5th steps. What are you saying? What's your response to the evidence or the references? How can you expand upon that? Can you compare it to something else? Bring in other references that introduce conflicting ideas. What does that tell you? How does that help you think more deeply about the question? So it's all that kind of really important work that tends to happen kind of in the middle and latter stages of a paragraph. And introductions and conclusions. This is something to tackle towards the end, which might feel a little bit odd. Sometimes it feels as though writing your introduction first is the obvious and logical thing to do. It's much easier to write an introduction last when you know what you are introducing, when the piece of work already exists and you can introduce it hopefully quite quickly and quite succinctly. A helpful way of tackling this is also to think about your introduction and conclusion as mirror images of one another. So this little hourglass image is here to kind of represent the kind of shape and I suppose focus of an introduction and conclusion. So an introduction, like the top part of the hourglass, the broadest part, will normally start quite broad. It might look at the bigger picture of your topic or your project, your assignment, what's that wider context, and then a good introduction kind of narrows down, so it becomes more specific. You kind of zoom in on the specific aspect of the debate or the topic that you're talking about, and towards the end of an introduction you'll normally map out what your assignment covers. So that's really quite specific and focused in terms of you and your interests. And then your conclusion does the opposite of that. So it's helpful to start a conclusion by recapping what you have done, what your essay or assignment has covered. And then you zoom back out again. So we're going back out to the broad, the bigger picture. You might want to put what you've discussed or argued within a wider context. There might be a wider practical setting that you want to kind of situate it in, or you might want to talk about its relevance more widely in relation to a particular sector. It depends what your subject area is, but normally we take what we've talked about in an essay, which might be something very niche, very specific, and we situate it back within that wider context, which is slightly kind of broader in scope.